thought, whose fault do you think this is? If you hadn't gambled away that money, we wouldn't be suffering like this. In the courtyard of an old farmhouse on the outskirts of Providence, a biting wind howls as three daughters-in-law sit slumped before a mountain of 300 pounds of apples. Hillary, the eldest, hurls a fruit in rage, oblivious to the frost nipping at her skin, while Samantha throws down her gloves in a bitter retort. At the edge of the porch, Beatrice, who had been staring blankly at the sky, slowly turns her head. "Is there gold hidden in those stems? Why are you digging through them like that?" she asks with hollow eyes, and the air in the courtyard instantly freezes. But in that fleeting second, a microscopic smile flickers across Beatrice's lips. The woman they believed was lost to dementia, the one they thought was a hollow shell, was secretly laughing as she watched her children tear each other apart for an inheritance. While the women scavenge with fire in their eyes and the sons grab each other by the collar to divide the land, a chaotic battle for the harvest begins. Who will ultimately claim the true treasure Beatrice has hidden? Will this family even survive the night to share a single meal together? Thank you for joining us at Miller Family Stories. Before we begin, please subscribe and like this video, and let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can send our warmest blessings your way. Now let us begin today's story. The morning in Providence, Rhode Island, arrived not with a sunrise but with a thick, silver shroud of fog that clung to the cobblestone streets and the ancient, gnarled branches of the orchard. In the heart of the city's quieter outskirts, the air carried the crisp, metallic scent of the Atlantic, mixed with the sweet, heavy perfume of fallen fruit. It was a weather that felt like a secret being kept, a damp veil that muffled the world, turning the towering pine trees into ghostly sentinels guarding the old Miller farmstead. In the center of the stone courtyard, the fog swirled around a mountain of apples, 300 pounds of crimson crisps and honey crisps, glowing like embers against the gray morning. Surrounding this vibrant pile were three women, their hands busy, but their hearts miles apart. Beatrice Miller, the matriarch of the estate, sat nearby on a weathered mahogany rocking chair. At 75, her silver hair was pulled back into a neat, fragile bun, and her face was a map of a life lived in the sun. Once known for her sharp wit and a laugh that could be heard across the valley, she now sat in a heavy wool shawl, her eyes fixed on the distant tree line. She moved with a slow, rhythmic sway, her gaze hollow and unblinking, projecting the perfect image of a mind lost to the mists of time. Watching her from the apple crates was Hillary, the eldest daughter-in-law. Hillary was a woman of sharp angles and expensive tastes, dressed in a designer trench coat that looked entirely out of place amidst the dirt and juice of an orchard. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, and her movements were efficient, though her eyes frequently darted toward the heavy brass ring of keys clipped to Beatrice's belt. The keys that led to the cellar, the safe, and the future. Beside her sat Samantha, the middle daughter-in-law, whose tired eyes and frayed cardigan spoke of a life spent chasing a dream of middle-class stability that was fast receding. She worked with a frantic energy, her shoulders hunched as if shielding herself from an invisible blow. And then there was Grace, the youngest. She was dressed in a simple denim jacket and muddy boots, her face scrubbed clean of makeup. She was the only one who didn't look at the house or the land as a prize. She looked at the apples as a legacy. "It's getting worse," Hillary remarked, her voice cutting through the damp air like a blade. She didn't look at Beatrice as she spoke, but rather at a particularly large apple she was peeling with aggressive precision. "The way she just stares. It's like there's nobody home anymore. We can't keep her here through the winter, Samantha. It's a liability." Samantha sighed, her hands stained red from the fruit. "The heating costs alone for this old drafty barn are killing us, Hillary. But this is her home. This is where Arthur promised her she'd always be." Beatrice's heart gave a faint, painful thud at the mention of Arthur. In the private theater of her mind, she could see him, her late husband, with his calloused hands and a smile that smelled of pipe tobacco and pine needles. She remembered the day they had stood on the edge of the 3-acre lot, the air thick with the scent of sap. "3 acres of Providence gold, Bee," he had whispered, wrapping his arm around her. "I promise you, as long as these pines stand, you'll have a place where the world can't touch you." She clutched the armrests of her chair, her knuckles whitening, but she kept her face as still as a mask. She had to know. She had to see what they would do when they thought the lioness of Providence had finally lost her teeth. Arthur's promises died with him, Hillary countered, tossing a peel into the dirt. 3 acres of prime real estate near the city line? Do you have any idea what a developer would pay for this? We're sitting on a gold mine while we play act as farmers. It's ridiculous. Grace, say something, Samantha pleaded, looking toward the youngest. Grace didn't look up from her work. She was carefully sorting the apples, placing the bruised ones aside for cider. I think the land belongs to the trees, and the house belongs to Beatrice. We're just guests here, Hillary. We should act like it. Hillary let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Guests? My husband is the eldest son. We've been propping up this estate for years. If Mother isn't present enough to sign the papers, we need to look into a legal guardianship. It's for her own safety. The argument drifted around Beatrice like the fog, cold and invasive. She watched a blue jay land on the stone wall, its vibrant feathers a stark contrast to the bitterness being spat across the apple crates. She felt a profound sense of loss, not of her mind, but of the family she thought she had built. She had raised her sons to be strong, but she had failed to see the rot that had entered through the branches of their marriages. Hillary stood up suddenly, her high heels clicking sharply on the stone. She walked over to Beatrice, leaning down until the scent of her expensive, cloying perfume overwhelmed the smell of the apples. Mother, Hillary said, her voice dripping with a fake sugary concern. Beatrice, can you hear me? It's Hillary, your favorite. Beatrice didn't move. She kept her eyes fixed on the pine forest, her breath slow and shallow. She could see the reflection of Hillary's predatory grin in the polished silver tray sitting on the side table, a tray Arthur had given her for their 25th anniversary. Hillary's expression shifted when she got no response. The concern vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating mask. She reached out, her gloved fingers hovering near the keys at Beatrice's waist, testing the waters of the old woman's awareness. She's completely gone, Hillary whispered to the others, though her eyes remained locked on Beatrice's face. Watch this. With a deliberate, cruel flick of her wrist, Hillary brushed the heavy silver tray off the table. It crashed onto the stone floor right next to Beatrice's feet with a deafening metallic clang that echoed through the quiet courtyard. A few apples nearby jumped from the vibration. Samantha gasped, clutching her chest. Grace stood up, her face pale with shock. Beatrice felt the vibration in the soles of her shoes. The sound was like a gunshot in the morning silence, a violent intrusion into her sanctuary. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to flinch, to shout, to let the fire in her soul blaze out and scorch the woman standing over her. But she didn't. She didn't blink. She didn't twitch. Her eyes remained fixed on the pines, her rocking chair continuing its slow, agonizingly steady pace. Inside, her heart was shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces, seeing the sheer lack of respect for her home and her memories. But the mask held. See? Hillary said, turning back to the others with a triumphant smirk. The lights are on, but the house is empty. We proceed with the Boston lawyers on Monday. We're selling the pine, Samantha, all 3 acres. Hillary walked back to her crate, leaving the silver tray face down in the dirt. Grace walked over, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, and knelt to pick up the tray. She wiped the mud off the silver with her sleeve and placed it gently back on the table. Grace then looked at Beatrice, reaching out to tuck the wool shawl tighter around the old woman's shoulders. I'm so sorry, Bea, she whispered so softly only the wind and Beatrice could hear. Beatrice sat in the silence that followed, the rocking chair creaking a mournful song. The fog began to lift, revealing the true colors of the autumn morning. But for Beatrice, the world had never looked more gray. The war for the Miller heartland had begun, and she was the only soldier who knew the battle lines had already been drawn. The sun finally began to burn through the stubborn Rhode Island fog, but it brought no warmth to the courtyard of the Miller farm. Instead, the light was harsh and unforgiving, highlighting every crack in the ancient stone and every bruise on the discarded apples. The silver tray sat back on the table, polished but harboring a fresh dent from its violent encounter with the floor, a silent testament to the fracture growing within the family. Hillary moved with a sudden, restless energy. Her designer coat, a beige wool masterpiece that cost more than Samantha's car, swished rhythmically as she paced the perimeter of the Apple Mountain. To a casual observer, she appeared to be tidying the space, tossing stray stems into a bin and straightening the crates. But Beatrice, sitting as still as a statue in her rocking chair, could feel the woman's predatory focus shifting. "Samantha, Grace, why don't you head into the kitchen and start the first boil for the preserves?" Hillary suggested, her voice smooth and authoritative. "I'll stay out here with Mother and finish sorting these Honey Crisps. The fresh air is doing me good." Samantha looked hesitant, wiping her juice-stained hands on her apron, but the exhaustion in her eyes won out. She nodded, following Grace toward the back porch. Grace paused at the door, glancing back at Beatrice with a look of lingering concern before the screen door clicked shut. The moment the door closed, the mask of the dutiful daughter-in-law dropped from Hillary's face. She didn't go to the apples. Instead, she stepped closer to Beatrice, her shadow falling long and cold over the old woman's lap. "You're quite the enigma today, aren't you, Bee?" Hillary whispered, her voice devoid of its earlier, sugary coating. "Just a hollow shell. No thoughts, no memories. Just a very expensive piece of furniture taking up space on 3 acres of prime development land." Hillary's phone buzzed in her pocket. She snatched it out, checking the screen. A look of genuine panic flitted across her features before she smoothed it into a scowl. She stepped away, pacing near the edge of the orchard, where the gnarled century-old trees stood in proud, silent rows. "I told you I'm working on it," Hillary hissed into the phone, her back to Beatrice. "The Boston mortgage isn't the problem. The problem is the bridge loan for the boutique. I just need another 2 weeks. This property is worth millions. The appraisal for the orchard alone, if we clear the trees for luxury condos, is off the charts. I'll have the signature soon, one way or another." Beatrice listened, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stared at the forest, but in her mind, she saw the numbers Hillary was tallying: the price of her memories, the cost of the ground where she had buried her favorite dog, and where Arthur had proposed. To Hillary, those trees weren't living things that had weathered 100 winters. They were obstacles to be bulldozed for a profit margin. Hillary ended the call and tucked the phone away. She turned back toward Beatrice, her eyes landing on the thick wool pockets of the matriarch's cardigan. She knew Beatrice always kept a small, tarnished brass key there, the key to the heavy oak door of the cider cellar, where the family's most private documents in the original land deed were kept in an iron lockbox. "Let's see if you've forgotten where you hide your secrets," Hillary murmured. She began to tidy Beatrice, leaning over her to adjust the heavy shawl. Her hands were frantic, her fingers probing the depths of the cardigan pockets. Beatrice felt the intrusive heat of Hillary's breath on her neck and the rough scrape of a diamond ring against her arm. She forced herself to remain limp, her breathing shallow, her eyes fixed on a distant point in the woods, even as Hillary's hand plunged deep into her left pocket. The intrusion was interrupted by the sound of a heavy engine. A rusty, mud-spattered pickup truck pulled into the gravel drive, and a man climbed out. Caleb Thorne, the local farrier and a longtime neighbor, walked toward them. He was a man made of leather and grit, his face lined by decades of outdoor labor. He carried a crate of specialized grafting tools he had promised to return to Arthur months ago. "Morning, Beatrice," Caleb called out, his voice a deep rumble. He stopped short, his eyes narrowing as he saw Hillary leaning over the matriarch. "Everything all right here?" Hillary jumped back, her face flushing crimson as she smoothed her coat. "Oh, Caleb, you startled me. I was just—" Mother felt a bit of a chill. "I was making sure she was bundled up properly." Caleb didn't look convinced. He walked over to Beatrice, placing a large warm hand on her shoulder. "She looks fine, just quiet, like the calm before a nor'easter." He looked at Hillary, his gaze piercing. "Arthur used to say these trees have souls. Hope you're taking care of them. They don't take kindly to being mistreated." "Of course, Caleb," Hillary snapped, her patience wearing thin. "We're doing what's best for the family. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a lot of work to do." Caleb lingered for a moment, patting Beatrice's shoulder once more before heading back to his truck. As soon as he was out of sight, the tension returned tenfold. Hillary was shaking now, her frustration reaching a boiling point. The key hadn't been in the pockets. She stood in front of Beatrice, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The facade of the Dawn Dep, cleaning, was gone. She looked at the old woman with a mixture of loathing and desperation. "You're just a burden now, Beatrice," Hilary spat, her voice rising in a sharp, jagged crescendo. "You sit there like a ghost while our lives are falling apart. Do you have any idea how much this place is costing us? All this history, all this soul, it's just rotting wood and dirt." Beatrice continued to rock, her gaze unwavering, though her soul felt bruised by the vitriol. This was the woman her eldest son had brought into their home, a woman who saw a price tag where there should have been a heart. "She's truly gone," Hilary shouted toward the house, her voice echoing off the stone walls so that Samantha and Grace would hear. "She's nothing but a hollow vessel now, a living corpse. We can't wait for a miracle that isn't coming. We have to send her to the nursing home immediately, before she loses what little value this place still has left. We're selling it all, and we're doing it now." Inside the house, a glass shattered. Beatrice sat in the wake of the outburst, the silence that followed feeling heavier than the fog. The war wasn't just about land anymore. It was about the very right to exist in her own home. The sharp echo of Hilary's ultimatum, labeling Beatrice a living corpse, hung in the crisp Providence air long after the words were spoken. Inside the house, the sound of shattered glass was followed by a heavy, stifling silence. Hilary stood in the center of the courtyard, her chest heaving under her beige wool coat, her eyes fixed on the back door as if daring anyone to challenge her authority. The screen door creaked open, and Samantha stepped out. Her face was pale, and her hands, still damp from the kitchen, trembled as she wiped them on a tattered apron. Behind her stood Leo Miller, Beatrice's middle son and Samantha's husband. Leo was a man whose spirit seemed to have been eroded by years of middle management stress. His shoulders were perpetually slumped, and his eyes carried a permanent squint of worry. "You can't just decide that, Hilary," Samantha said, her voice thin but vibrating with a desperate edge. "You can't just ship her off to a facility like she's a piece of unwanted inventory." Hilary turned on her, her expression curdling into a sneer. "Oh, spare me the moral high ground, Samantha. I've seen your bank statements. I know you're 3 months behind on your mortgage, and that your daughter's college tuition is due by the end of the week. You need this land sold just as much as I do." Samantha flinched as if struck. The debt was a suffocating weight, a phantom hand always hovering near her throat. She looked at Beatrice, who continued to rock with agonizing steadiness, her gaze lost in the shifting shadows of the pine forest. For a fleeting second, a memory flickered in Samantha's mind, vivid and warm. She saw herself 10 years younger, standing in Beatrice's sun-drenched kitchen. Beatrice's hands, then strong and steady, were over hers, guiding her as she learned to crimp the edges of a butter crust. "The secret to a good apple pie, Sam," Beatrice had whispered, the scent of cinnamon and warm sugars enveloping them, "is patience. You can't rush the harvest, and you can't force the fruit to be sweet before it's time. You treat the ingredients with respect, and they'll take care of you." Beatrice had been the mother Samantha never had, a grounding force in a chaotic world. But as Samantha looked at the pile of apples and the vast, valuable expanse of the orchard, that warmth was snuffed out by the cold reality of her mounting bills. Gratitude was a luxury she felt she could no longer afford. "I'm not saying we don't need the money," Samantha countered, her voice growing shrill as she stepped off the porch into the courtyard. "But we have to be smart. If we rush a sale now, we're leaving millions on the table. My husband deserves an equal share of the development rights, not just whatever crumbs your Boston lawyers decide to toss us." Leo stepped forward, his voice a weak attempt at mediation. "Maybe we could just divide the back lot first? Leave the house for now?" "Divide the lot?" Hilary laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "And ruin the contiguous acreage? The developers want the whole parcel or nothing. Beatrice is the bottleneck. As long as she's sitting here, playing the part of the tragic relic, we're all drowning in her sentimentality. She's a hurdle, Leo, a hurdle we need to jump over." Beatrice listened to them discuss her as if she were a fallen tree blocking a road. The hurdle, the bottleneck. The pain in her chest was no longer a dull ache. It was a sharp, piercing cold. She thought of Arthur and the way he had labored over every sapling, believing he was building a sanctuary for his family's future. Instead, he had unwittingly cultivated a crop of greed. Grace emerged from the house, her eyes red-rimmed, but her jaw set. "Stop it, both of you. She can hear you. Even if you think she's gone, have some decency." "Decency doesn't pay the bills, Grace," Samantha snapped, spinning around to face the younger woman. "It's easy for you to be noble when you don't have debt collectors calling your house every hour. You're just a guest here, remember? You don't get a vote in what happens to this property." "I'm family," Grace shouted back, her voice breaking. "You're a Miller by marriage to the youngest son who barely makes enough to cover your gas to get here?" Hillary intervened, stepping toward Grace with a menacing grace. "Samantha and I are the ones dealing with the reality of this estate. Now get out of the way." Hillary reached for a crate of apples, intending to move it toward her car as a symbolic start to clearing the space. Samantha, fearing Hillary was trying to claim more than her share of the day's assets, lunged forward to grab the other side of the crate. "Let go, Samantha. I'm taking these to the appraiser in the city," Hillary hissed. "Like hell you are. We haven't agreed on the division yet," Samantha yelled, pulling back. The two women grappled over the heavy wooden crate. Hillary's expensive coat brushed against the rough wood, and Samantha's damp apron caught on a splinter. They were no longer sisters-in-law. They were two desperate ghosts fighting over a scrap of life. "Let it go!" Hillary screamed, giving a violent, sideways yank. Samantha's foot slipped on a patch of damp moss. As she fell, she took the crate with her. It struck the corner of the stone table and flipped, the heavy wood splintering with a sickening crack. The 300 pounds of apples, the vibrant heart of the morning, were unleashed. They cascaded across the courtyard like a tidal wave of red and gold. Dozens of them rolled directly toward Beatrice's feet, thudding against the rockers of her chair. They rolled into the dirt, bruising against the stones, being crushed under the feet of the brawling women. Beatrice looked down. Her shoes were surrounded by the ruined fruit. In those rolling apples, she didn't see food. She saw the crushed hopes of her husband, the trampled memories of her children's youth, and the utter disintegration of the home she had spent 50 years protecting. Hillary stood over Samantha, who was sprawled in the mud, both of them breathing hard, their hair disheveled and their faces masks of naked fury. "Look at this mess," Hillary breathed, her voice trembling with rage as she looked at the bruised fruit littering the ground at Beatrice's feet. "This is exactly why she needs to go. This whole place is just a pile of rot." Beatrice's rocking chair didn't stop. The rhythmic creak thud against the fallen apples was the only sound in the courtyard, a steady, haunting pulse that seemed to count down the final hours of the Miller legacy. The courtyard fell into a heavy, suffocating silence after the storm of fruit. The vibrant red honeycrisps lay scattered across the damp stones like casualties of a war no one had asked for. Hillary stood over Samantha, her chest heaving, her expensive coat stained with a smear of apple pulp that looked like a fresh bruise. Samantha remained on the ground, her breathing ragged, staring at the splintered remains of the wooden crate. Beatrice continued to rock. The wood of her chair made a rhythmic, hollow sound against the stones. Creak, thud, as the rockers rolled over the smaller, crushed pieces of fruit. She felt the cold juice seeping toward the soles of her shoes, a sticky reminder of the chaos her children had wrought. While Hillary and Samantha were locked in a silent standoff of mutual loathing, Grace moved. She didn't shout, and she didn't join the fray. Instead, she knelt in the mud. With a quiet, heartbreaking dignity, she began to pick up the apples one by one. She didn't look at the other women. She only looked at the fruit, cradling each bruised orb in her palms, as if she were handling something sacred. Julian Miller, Beatrice's youngest son, emerged from the shadows of the orchard's edge. Unlike his brothers, Julian lacked the polished edge of a businessman or the weary look of a middle manager. He was a landscape artist by trade, with hair the color of autumn wheat and hands that were perpetually stained with charcoal or soil. He walked with a slight limp, a souvenir from a childhood fall off the very pine trees Hillary wanted to bulldoze. He walked to Grace's side and knelt beside her, his hand covering hers as she reached for a crushed Macintosh. "Grace, let it go," Julian whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of shame and exhaustion. "It's just fruit. My brothers, they've already decided the fate of this place. We're outvoted, and we're out of money." Grace stopped, an apple clutched to her chest. She looked at her husband, her eyes brimming with a fierce, quiet fire. "It isn't just fruit, Julian. This is the last thing Arthur planted. This is the scent of the kitchen every November. This is the only place in the world where I ever felt like I truly belonged to a family. She leaned closer to him, her voice dropping to a low, melodic murmur. I don't care about the 3 acres of Providence gold. I don't care about luxury condos or bridge loans. I just want to keep the smell of the jam in the air. That mutt towel, it's the soul of this house. If they sell the land, the soul dies. And if the soul dies, Beatrice won't have anything left to hold on to. Julian looked at his mother, then back at his wife. He saw the way Grace's denim jacket was soaked through with the morning dew, and the way her fingers were turning blue from the cold stones. He realized then that Grace wasn't fighting for an inheritance. She was fighting for a memory. I'll help you, Julian said softly. Together they worked in the shadow of the brawling sisters-in-law, clearing the path around Beatrice's chair. Hilary watched them with a look of pure derision. Look at you two, playing house in the mud. You can keep your soul, Grace. Samantha and I will keep the checkbooks. She turned on her heel and marched toward her car, the clicking of her heels a sharp, ugly staccato against the silence. Samantha scrambled to her feet, throwing one last resentful glance at the apples before following Hilary into the house to call her lawyers. Once the courtyard was clear of the others, Grace stood up. Her knees were stained dark with earth. She approached Beatrice, who remained fixed on the distant forest. Grace pulled a small glass vial from her apron pocket. It was filled with a golden, viscous oil she had infused herself with lavender and rosemary, herbs from Beatrice's neglected garden. She sat on the small stone stool at Beatrice's feet, right where the apples had been the thickest. You're freezing, Beatrice, Grace whispered. She took Beatrice's hands. They were stiff, the skin like parchment, cold as the Providence Atlantic in winter. Grace began to rub the herbal oil into the old woman's palms. Her touch was firm, yet incredibly tender, her thumbs tracing the lines of Beatrice's life. The scars from old paring knives, the calluses from years of gardening, the wedding ring that now hung loose on a thinning finger. The scent of the herbs rose between them, cutting through the heavy, cloying smell of the crushed apples. It was a smell of healing, of ancient things, of a woman who cared for the roots as much as the fruit. Beatrice felt the warmth of the oil penetrating her skin. She felt the heat of Grace's life force, a stark contrast to the predatory coldness she had felt from Hilary earlier. The rocking chair slowed. Beatrice's breathing hitched, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor in her chest. She wanted to weep. She wanted to pull this girl into her arms and tell her she was the only one who had truly understood the Miller legacy. But the mask had to hold. The trap was not yet sprung. Grace leaned in closer, her face just inches from Beatrice's ear. The girl's hair brushed against Beatrice's cheek, smelling of rain and wood smoke. Grace's voice was a soft, urgent thread of sound, vibrating with a promise that felt like a shield. Con biet mi van ojo, Grace whispered, her voice cracking, slightly with emotion. I know you're still in there, Beatrice. I saw your eyes when the tray hit the floor. I see the way you hold Arthur's ring. Beatrice's heart hammered against her ribs. She kept her eyes locked on the trees, but she felt a single, microscopic bead of sweat form at her temple. Don't be afraid, Grace continued, her hand squeezing Beatrice's fingers with a strength that was surprising. They see a hurdle, but I see my mother. They see a gold mine, but I see a home. I don't care what Hilary says. I don't care about the lawyers. I'm not going to let them take you away. I will protect you until my last breath. I will keep the fires burning, Beatrice. I promise. Grace stayed there for a long time, her forehead resting against Beatrice's knee, her hands still cradling the matriarch's palms. The fog had completely vanished, leaving the Providence sky a sharp, piercing blue. The orchard stood silent, the trees waiting for the next gust of wind. Beatrice felt a warmth in her chest she hadn't felt since the day Arthur died. It was the warmth of a fire being rekindled. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She had an ally. As she looked out at the pine forest, the trees no longer looked like ghostly sentinels. They looked like an army, standing guard over a secret that was finally beginning to breathe. The night descended upon Providence with a biting, damp chill that seemed to seep through the very stones of the Miller farmhouse. Outside, the wind had picked up, a restless autumnal gale that whistled through the skeletal branches of the orchard and rattled the window panes in their wooden frames. Inside, the house was a labyrinth of long shadows and creaking floorboards, holding its breath as the clock in the hallway struck midnight with a dull, heavy chime. Beatrice lay in her bed, her eyes wide open in the darkness. She was no longer the rocking chair specter of the daylight. She was a sentinel. The scent of Grace's herbal oil still lingered on her skin, a faint trail of lavender and rosemary that acted as a tether to her sanity. She heard the soft, muffled click of a door hinge from down the hall, followed by the unmistakable whisper of silk rubbing against wool. In the shadows of the downstairs hallway, Hillary and Samantha moved like twin phantoms. Hillary had traded her designer coat for a dark, sleek athletic jacket, her blonde hair tucked tightly under a cap. She carried a heavy-duty flashlight and a small velvet pouch of tools she had borrowed from a locksmith friend in Boston. Samantha followed tentatively, her breathing shallow and jagged, her eyes darting toward the stairs every few seconds. "I'm telling you, it's down there," Hillary hissed, her voice barely audible over the wind. Arthur was old school. He didn't trust banks after the '08 crash. Caleb Thorne mentioned once that Arthur kept a emergency reserve for the estate. If we find that cash, we don't have to wait for the developers to clear the bridge loan. We can settle the tuition and the mortgage by Monday morning. Samantha hugged her cardigan closer to her chest. "Hillary, this feels wrong. This is the cellar. Grace and Julian are just in the guest wing. If they hear us..." "Grace and Julian are dreamers, Samantha. They're sleeping the sleep of the righteous and the broke," Hillary countered, her eyes gleaming with a hard, cold light in the flash of her phone screen. "Now help me with this door." The door to the cider cellar was a heavy slab of oak, reinforced with iron straps. It groaned as they pushed it open, a long, low sound that seemed to be echoed by the wind outside. They descended the stone steps, the air growing thick with the smell of damp earth, fermented fruit, and ancient dust. Hillary's flashlight cut a stark clinical path through the gloom. It passed over rows of dusty cider jugs and crates of gardening tools until it landed on a corner obscured by a heavy canvas tarp. Beneath the tarp sat a heavy iron-bound oak chest, the ronku, the chest Beatrice had guarded with her presence all day. Hillary didn't hesitate. She knelt in the dust, her gloved fingers trembling slightly as she selected a tension wrench from her pouch. "Arthur always said the heart of the farm was in the cellar. He wasn't talking about the cider, Sam." The wind outside intensified, a sudden gust shrieking through the small high cellar vents. It sounded like a high mocking laugh, a jagged staccato that made Samantha jump. "Did you hear that? It sounds like someone is laughing at us." "It's just a draft, Samantha. Focus," Hillary snapped. The lock was old and stubborn, but Hillary's desperation was a powerful catalyst. After several agonizing minutes, there was a sharp metallic snick. The heavy lid groaned as they heaved it open together. Their hearts raced. They expected the dull glint of gold coins, the crisp green of stacked hundreds, or, at the very least, a clear, signed land deed that bypassed any probate hurdles. Instead, the flashlight beam revealed a collection of ghosts. On top lay a pair of tiny scuffed leather shoes, the ones Leo had worn when he took his first steps in the orchard. Beneath them was a bundle of yellowed envelopes tied with a faded blue ribbon. Hillary snatched them up, tearing the ribbon away. She scanned the first page, her face twisting in frustration. It's just letters," she breathed, her voice cracking. "Love letters. Arthur writing to her from the hospital when Julian was born. 'My dearest B, the trees are waiting for you to come home.'" Samantha reached in, her hand brushing against a knitted baby blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. She pulled out a small wooden carving of a robin, one Julian had made when he was 7. At the very bottom of the chest lay a dried rose, its petals turned to dark, brittle parchment. "Where is it?" Samantha whispered, her voice rising in panic. "Where's the money? Hillary, you said there was money. I have 3 days to pay that tuition. My daughter's going to be kicked out of her dorm." Hillary began flinging the items out of the chest. The tiny shoes hit the stone floor with a hollow thud. The letters scattered like dead leaves in the drafty cellar. "It has to be here. The false bottom. The lining." She clawed at the oak interior, her nails scraping against the wood. "There's nothing. There's absolutely nothing but junk. Old, sentimental junk. The wind shrieked again, a violent buffet against the house that caused the cellar door at the top of the stairs to rattle in its frame. Samantha began to sob, a quiet, broken sound. We broke into her heart for nothing, Hillary. We're just thieves in a cellar. Shut up, Hillary hissed, standing up and kicking the chest. The flashlight in her hand flickered. Suddenly, the draft in the cellar vanished. The air became unnaturally still, the whistling wind silenced as if a hand had been placed over the mouth of the storm. A faint light appeared at the top of the stairs, not the harsh LED of a phone, but the warm, flickering amber of a candle. Hillary and Samantha froze, their shadows stretching long and distorted against the cellar walls. They looked up. Beatrice stood at the top of the stone steps. She wasn't rocking. She wasn't staring into the distance with hollow eyes. She stood tall, her silver hair shimmering in the candlelight, her wool shawl draped around her shoulders like a regal robe. Her eyes, usually veiled by the fog of her performance, were piercing and terrifyingly clear. They moved slowly over the scene below, the broken lock, the scattered baby shoes, the love letters discarded in the dust. The candlelight caught the sharp lines of her face, making her look like a mythological figure of judgment. She didn't speak. She didn't scream. She simply looked at them, her gaze a heavy, crushing weight of silent condemnation. In that moment, Beatrice Miller wasn't a victim of time. She was the master of the house. Hillary's flashlight slipped from her numb fingers, clattering onto the stones and rolling into the shadows. "Mother?" Samantha whimpered, her voice barely a breath. Beatrice didn't acknowledge the word. She took one step back, the candle flame dancing in the sudden movement, and then she was gone. The cellar door didn't slam. It clicked shut with a finality that felt like a sentence being passed. The wind returned with a roar, slamming against the house, but in the dark cellar, the two women remained motionless, surrounded by the discarded remnants of a love they had never understood. The morning of Thanksgiving arrived in Providence with a deceptive serenity. A thin frost coated the dormant orchard, sparkling like crushed diamonds under a pale wintry sun. Inside the Miller farmhouse, however, the air was thick with a different kind of chill. The incident in the cellar had left Hillary and Samantha shaken, their eyes rimmed with shadows, but the desperation of their debts had quickly cauterized their shame. Instead of repentance, a hardened, defensive malice had taken root. Beatrice was back in her rocking chair by the hearth, the mask of the vacant matriarch firmly in place. To the others, she was once again a bottleneck to be bypassed. But behind her glazed eyes, she was a judge who had already seen the evidence. She watched as her family prepared for the feast, a ritual that was supposed to be about gratitude, now twisted into a theater of war. Grace moved through the kitchen with a quiet, focused grace. She ignored the sharp glances from Hillary and the nervous fidgeting of Samantha. Her entire world was narrowed down to a large copper pot on the stove. This was the moot tao, the traditional apple jam that had been the heartbeat of every Miller Thanksgiving for 80 years. She stirred it slowly, the scent of cinnamon, cloves, and tart Honeycrisps filling the house, a sweet, nostalgic armor against the bitterness in the room. The dining table was soon laden with a turkey, roasted root vegetables, and silver platters, but the seats were filled with strangers. Silas Miller, the eldest son and Hillary's husband, had finally arrived from Boston. He was a man who wore his success like a heavy, suffocating coat. His hair was prematurely gray at the temples, and he possessed a booming voice that he used to drown out any opinion that wasn't his own. He sat at the head of the table, tapping his gold watch, his eyes constantly scanning the room for things to appraise. "We need to be realistic, Silas," Hillary said, her voice tight as she carved a slice of turkey. She hadn't looked at Beatrice since the meal began. "The maintenance on this place is a sinkhole. It's not just about the orchard, it's about the structural integrity of the house. We're doing her a favor by liquidating now." "Liquidation?" Leo countered, his voice reedy and defensive. "You mean a fire sale so you can cover your boutique's bridge loan? Samantha and I have a right to the back lot. We've already spoken to a separate realtor." "A realtor?" Silas barked, his fork clattering against his plate. "Without consulting me? I'm the executor of the estate in spirit, if not yet in law. Neither of you has the capital to manage a split parcel sale. It's the whole 3 acres or nothing. Beatrice watched them. She saw Silas, the boy she had once nursed through scarlet fever, now tallying the price of the floorboards beneath his feet. She saw Leo, the child who used to hide in her skirts, now baring his teeth at his brother over a line on a map. They were unlikely heroes who had turned into villains of their own making. She felt a profound, echoing loss, a silent voice of grief that transcended language. "What about Mom?" Grace asked, her voice a soft, steady thrum through the shouting. She was standing by the sideboard, carefully spooning the warm amber mutao into a crystal bowl, the same bowl Beatrice had used since 1965. "Does anyone care that she's sitting right there? This is her home. These are her memories." "Memories don't keep the lights on, Grace," Hillary snapped, her face flushing a dark, ugly red. "You and Julian are like children playing in a dollhouse. You provide nothing but sentimentality while we provide the solutions." "Solutions?" Julian stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the wood floor. "You mean the destruction of everything Dad built? You want to pave over the pines so you can have a luxury zip code. You're not saving the family, Hillary. You're cannibalizing it." The insults began to fly like shrapnel. Silas accused Leo of incompetence. Leo accused Silas of greed. Samantha wept about her daughter's tuition, blaming Julian's artistic laziness for not contributing more to the estate's upkeep. It was a cacophony of strong emotions, a shock to the very foundation of the home. Beatrice sat at the foot of the table, her plate untouched. She looked at Grace, who was still holding the crystal bowl, her knuckles white. Grace's eyes met Beatrice's for a split second, a soul connection that Hillary and Samantha were too blind to see. "I'm serving the jam now," Grace said, her voice trembling but determined. She walked toward the table, the bowl of mut tao, the literal fruit of their labor, shimmering in the candlelight. It was the transformation of pain into a small, sweet offering. Hillary's eyes snapped to the bowl. To her, it represented everything she hated about this place. The slow pace, the clinging to the past, the miracle of tradition that she found useless. As Grace reached out to place the bowl in the center of the table, Hillary stood up with a violent, jagged motion. "We don't need your damn jam, Grace. We need a signature." With a deliberate, cruel sweep of her arm, Hillary struck Grace's hands. The crystal bowl flew from Grace's grip. It hit the edge of the mahogany table and shattered. The mut tao, the hours of peeling, the rosemary, the legacy of 80 years, exploded across the floor. It splattered against the legs of the chairs, stained the hem of Beatrice's shawl, and spread like a warm, sticky wound across the dark wood. Silence fell, sudden and absolute. Grace stood frozen, her empty hands still outstretched, tears finally spilling over. Hillary didn't look sorry. She looked triumphant. "There. Now maybe we can focus on what actually matters." But the focus shifted in a way Hillary never expected. The justice and redemption that had been simmering in Beatrice's soul finally boiled over. Bam! Beatrice Miller's hand struck the table with a force that made the silver jump and the glasses ring. The sound was like a thunderclap in the small room. Before anyone could breathe, Beatrice stood up. She didn't struggle. She didn't wobble. She rose with a terrifying, mythic strength, her height suddenly dwarfing everyone at the table. Her eyes weren't vacant. They were blazing with a call to faith in the truth that was about to be revealed. She looked at Hillary, then Silas, then Leo and Samantha. Her gaze was a physical weight, a miracle of clarity that restored a grim kind of faith in the power of the matriarch. "You have spilled the last of the sweetness in this house," Beatrice said. Her voice wasn't a whisper. It was a low, resonant bell that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. Every person at the table stood frozen, their mouths agape, their greed momentarily paralyzed by the shock of her presence. The wounded dog of the family had finally turned, and the heartbreak was about to belong to them. The silence that followed Beatrice's sudden rise was not a peaceful one. It was the heavy, pressurized quiet that precedes a mountain's collapse. The spilled mut tao lay like a dark, sticky wound across the mahogany table, its sweet scent now cloying and funerary. Hillary stood frozen, her hand still half extended from the strike that had shattered the bowl, her face a mask of pale, stuttering disbelief. Beatrice did not sit back down. She stood at the foot of the table, her spine straight as one of the ancient pines she had spent a lifetime defending. The vacant fog had vanished from her eyes, replaced by a searing, diamond-like clarity that seemed to strip her children and their wives down to their very skeletons. "You thought you were ghosts haunting a ruin," Beatrice began, her voice a low, resonant bell that vibrated through the silver and the crystal. "But you were merely guests in a house that still has a master." "Mother?" Silas stammered, his booming corporate voice reduced to a thin, brittle reed. You can hear us? You understand what's happening?" Beatrice turned her gaze toward her eldest son. "I heard every word, Silas. I heard the price you put on the floorboards where you took your first steps. I heard the tally of the trees your father planted with his own bleeding hands." She looked at Samantha and Leo. "I heard the bottleneck and the hurdle. I felt your hands in my pockets, Hillary, searching for a key to a heart you never cared to know." Samantha began to sob, a jagged, ugly sound of pure terror. "We were desperate, Beatrice. We have debts. We have lives to save. And you thought you could save them by burning your mother's soul for fuel?" Beatrice's voice didn't rise, but its weight increased. "Faith is not something you use to decorate a dining room table. It is the ground you stand on, and you have all chosen to stand on sand." Beatrice reached into the deep hidden pocket of her wool shawl, the one Hillary had missed in the cellar, and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope bound with a crimson seal. The room seemed to shrink as she placed it on the table, right in the center of the spilled jam. "For months I watched you," Beatrice said, her eyes softening only when they landed on Grace, who was still trembling by the sideboard. "I wanted to see if even a spark of the Miller legacy remained in any of you. I looked for a hero in an unlikely place, but I only found strangers wearing my children's faces." Hillary's eyes darted to the envelope. Is that the deed?" "Beatrice, listen, we can still talk about this. The Boston developers can find another grave to rob," Beatrice interrupted. She opened the envelope with a slow, deliberate grace. "I have already met with Elias Thorne, Caleb's brother and the city's most tenacious land use attorney. Elias Thorne was a man as sharp as a winter frost, known in Providence for his encyclopedic knowledge of conservation easements and his utter disdain for luxury high-rises. He had been a silent ghost in this story, a silent voice guiding Beatrice through the legal labyrinth while she played her part. "3 days ago, the paperwork was finalized," Beatrice announced. 2 acres of this property, the forest, the orchard, and the ridge, have been legally Hyantang donated to the Rhode Island Forest Preservation Trust. It can never be developed. It can never be paved. It will remain as Arthur intended, a sanctuary for the wind and the trees." A collective gasp of horror erupted from Hillary and Silas. "You gave it away!" Silas roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "That was our inheritance. That was millions. It was never yours to sell." Beatrice's voice finally cracked like a whip. "It belonged to the future. And as for this house and the remaining acre," she looked at Grace, "this property requires a heart that knows the value of a bruised apple. It requires a hand that rubs oil into tired skin without asking for a signature in return. Grace, you are the only one who didn't come here to harvest my bones. The house and the remaining land are yours." Grace shook her head, her voice a faint whisper. "Beatrice, I didn't do it for the land." "I know," Beatrice said softly. "That is why it must be you. You are the transformation this family needs, the healing journey that starts with the truth." Hillary lunged toward the table, her composure completely shattered. "This is a senile delusion. You can't do this. We'll fight it in every court in the state." Beatrice didn't flinch. She reached back into her shawl and pulled out a second, smaller folder. This one wasn't a deed. It was a collection of photocopies, bank statements, bridge loan defaults, and a private investigator's report on the boutique in Boston. "Justice is a bitter fruit, Hillary, but it is a necessary one," Beatrice said. With a gesture of mythic finality, Beatrice Nem threw the folders onto the table. They skidded through the spilled muttow, the pages fanning out like the wings of a fallen bird. I know about the bridge loans. I know about the forged signatures you attempted on the mortgage applications. And I know about the emergency reserve you were looking for in the cellar. Hillary stared at the documents, her face draining of all color. The justice and redemption Beatrice had promised herself was now a physical reality on the table. You wanted to sell my memories to pay for your vanity, Beatrice said, her voice echoing with the authority of a goddess of the harvest. Kemon benji kinyam, kwa me min kong sungjang, komot tak jat now ojai. Those who wish to sell their mother's memories deserve not a single inch of this earth. Silas and Hillary stood paralyzed, the weight of their own greed finally crushing them. Samantha slumped back into her chair, her face buried in her hands, realizing that in her desperate rush to save her finances, she had lost the only person who would have truly helped her out of love. Beatrice stood tall at the head of the table, the candlelight casting her shadow against the wall. A towering, majestic figure that looked less like a fragile old woman and more like the living soul of the Providence Pines. The miracle had occurred. The truth had restored the faith of the house, even if it had broken the hearts of the wicked. The harvest is over, Beatrice said, her voice a final, echoing command. And the wheat has been separated from the chaff. The winter that followed the great reckoning at the Miller farm was the harshest Providence had seen in decades. Snow buried the orchard in a thick, silent blanket of white, and the Atlantic winds howled against the sturdy stones of the farmhouse. Yet inside, for the first time in years, there was a warmth that had nothing to do with the roaring fire in the hearth. Hillary and Samantha had departed that Thanksgiving night, their shadows retreating into the cold dark of the highway, leaving behind a house that felt lighter, as if a great weight of deceit had been lifted from its rafters. Beatrice spent those winter months by the fire, no longer a ghost in her own home, but a woman reclaiming her throne. She and Grace spent long evenings together, the silent voice of their bond now articulated through shared stories and the rhythmic click of knitting needles. Julian moved his studio into the sunroom, his charcoal sketches no longer capturing the rot of the orchard, but the resilient strength of the old pines. The unlikely hero of the family had found his place at the center of the sanctuary he once thought lost. As the iron grip of winter finally loosened, a miracle began to unfold across the 3 acres of Providence gold. The transformation was not just in the weather, but in the very soil itself. By late May, the orchard was no longer a graveyard of bruised fruit. It was a sea of white. Thousands upon thousands of apple blossoms erupted at once, turning the farm into a mythic landscape of snow-colored petals that smelled of honey and fresh beginnings. One Tuesday morning, as Grace was kneeling in the dirt of the kitchen garden, a familiar silver car pulled into the gravel drive. It wasn't the aggressive, high-speed arrival of the previous autumn. The car moved slowly, almost hesitantly. Hillary climbed out. She was no longer wearing the armored designer coat that had once defined her. She wore a simple cotton blouse and jeans, her face scrubbed of the hard clinical makeup she had used as a shield. "Hillary," Grace asked, standing up and brushing the soil from her knees. Hillary stopped several feet away, looking out at the white blossoms. "Beatrice told me once that these trees take 100 years to truly find their roots," Hillary said, her voice soft and lacking its former edge. "I think I spent my whole life trying to pull mine up." Hillary had spent her winter in the quiet hum of a small apartment, the luxury boutique in Boston a shuttered memory. The legal justice Beatrice had delivered had forced her into a healing journey of accountability. She had worked off her debts in a way that didn't involve bulldozing memories. "I didn't come for the land, Grace," Hillary continued, her eyes meeting the younger woman's with a raw, emotion-based sincerity. "I came to ask if you need an extra pair of hands. I realized I don't know how to grow anything. I only know how to take things apart." Grace looked at her sister-in-law, seeing the wounded dog beneath the once arrogant exterior. She reached out, offering a pair of gardening shears. "The Honeycrisps need thinning, Hillary. It's a start." In the weeks that followed, a strange and beautiful rhythm took hold. Samantha arrived shortly after, her daughter in tow. Maya Miller, a bright-eyed 19-year-old with her grandmother's sharp chin and a passion for environmental science. Maya had taken a semester off to help her mother navigate their new reality, and in the process, she became the bridge that reconnected Samantha to the soil. Samantha, Hillary, and Grace worked side by side in the transformation of the orchard. They pruned, they weeded, and they learned the language of the trees. Beatrice watched them from the porch, a miracle of reconciliation unfolding before her eyes. The justice and redemption she had sought wasn't found in the punishment of her children, but in their return to the values Arthur had cherished. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long golden fingers across the blossoming rose, Beatrice called Grace into the house. They descended together into the cider cellar. It was no longer the dark, terrifying place where Hillary had hunted for gold. Grace had cleaned it, polishing the stone steps and organizing the crates of preserves. Beatrice led her to the very back, behind the oak chest Hillary had ransacked. She pulled aside a loose stone in the foundation, a secret Arthur had kept even from his sons. Behind it lay a velvet-lined box. Beatrice opened it, but she didn't pull out money or deeds. She pulled out a heavy, intricately carved iron key. Hillary looked in the pockets, and she looked in the wrong coup. Beatrice whispered, her voice a call to faith in the endurance of love. But she didn't know that the real treasure isn't what pays the bills. It's what pays the soul. Beatrice took Grace's hand and led her to a small, unassuming door at the very back of the cellar, one that looked like part of the wall. She inserted the key. The door creaked open to reveal a small, temperature-controlled vault. Inside were hundreds of small glass jars, each meticulously labeled in Arthur's steady hand. Seed banks, Grace, Beatrice said, her eyes shimmering with heartbreak and joy. Every heirloom variety of apple Arthur ever grew, strains that have died out everywhere else in New England. This is the genetic history of this land. This is why the developers could never have it. They would have paved over the future. Beatrice placed the iron key into Grace's palm. The weight of it was immense, a miracle of trust passed between generations. Kon ja gyu joch lin hon kwa gya jin nai, Beatrice said, her voice resonant with the justice of a life well lived. You didn't just save the house, Grace. You saved the seeds. You kept the fires burning when everyone else wanted to ash them out. This is the true inheritance. Beatrice stepped back, looking at the girl she had chosen. Hillary and Samantha have learned their lesson. They are finding their way back to the light. But you are the light. Grace gripped the key, the metal cool and solid. She looked at the jars of seeds, thousands of potential lives waiting for their turn in the sun. She realized then that the miracle, faith-based hook of their family wasn't about the land being a gold mine. It was about the land being a womb. They walked back up into the kitchen, where the scent of baking bread and fresh herbs filled the air. Julian was at the table laughing with Maya about a sketch she was trying to finish. Hillary and Samantha were at the sink, washing the day's dirt from their hands, talking quietly about the upcoming harvest. Beatrice sat in her rocking chair, not as a victim of a shocking illness, but as a guardian of a healing journey that had finally come home. The silent voice of the Miller legacy was no longer a whisper. It was a chorus. The light of the Providence moon began to rise over the white blossoms of the orchard. It was a timeless myth told with modern tenderness, a story of how a mother's justice had turned a house of greed back into a home of grace. As the family gathered around the table, Beatrice closed her eyes, listening to the laughter. The apples would grow, the seeds would be planted, and the soul of the Miller farm would endure for 100 years more. The story of the Miller family reminds us that the true value of our lives is not measured by the numbers in a bank account or the size of an estate, but by the seeds of love and integrity we plant in the hearts of others. Greed acts like a frost that kills the blossoms of the soul, while selflessness and sincerity are the sunlight that allows a family to endure the harshest winters. In our daily lives, let us remember that memories are a sacred inheritance that no amount of money can replace. True wealth is found in the hands that serve without asking for a reward, and in the hearts that choose to protect the legacy of those who came before us. If this story touched your heart today, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to be reminded of the power of family and faith. Don't forget to comment your thoughts below and subscribe to our channel for more stories of hope, justice, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Dear Lord, we thank you for the gift of family and the wisdom that comes through life's trials. We ask you to bless every person watching this video today. Soften the hearts that are hardened by the pressures of this world and provide comfort to those who feel lonely or forgotten. Help us to be like the good soil, nurturing the seeds of kindness and truth in everything we do. Guide our steps so that we may honor our parents and protect the memories of our homes. May your grace and peace be upon your household now and forever. If you believe that God still performs miracles and can restore the broken pieces of a family, please write Amen in the comments below.